I take the digital balance. I think the connection is... Yes, we are connected. Start the broadcast now.
Good evening. The Digital Madman. Broadcasting from somewhere safe. A war that killed 58,000 Americans started with an attack that the intelligence record says never happened. Congress voted anyway. The doubt was already in the room. And someone made sure it stayed off the page. All declassified, all documented, all sitting in a footnote nobody read. Let's begin. The second Gulf of Tonkin attack never happened. Not disputed, not debated, established. The National Security Agency declassified nearly 200 documents between 2005 and 2006, and what they show is this. On the night of August 4th, 1964, there were no North Vietnamese vessels in the water. No attack on the USS Maddox, no second incident. The event that sent 58,000 Americans to die in Vietnam did not occur. The NSA's own historian, Robert J. Hanyok, analyzed the signals intelligence files and found that NSA personnel had ignored 90% of the raw intercepts they collected that night. 90%. The material that didn't support an attack narrative was set aside. The 10% that could be read as supporting one was forwarded up the chain. The reports that reached the president carried only the favorable fraction. The other 9/10 went nowhere. We weren't told that. We weren't supposed to notice. Here is what the Johnson Library recordings show about the night of August 4th, 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson prepared to address the American public about a North Vietnamese attack on U.S. warships. While he was preparing that address, his own government was still trying to find evidence the attack had happened. The recordings and transcripts from that night document the uncertainty directly. Johnson wasn't certain. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara wasn't certain. The U.S. commander in the Gulf, the officer who had filed the initial report of an attack, had by that point expressed serious doubts about his own report and was requesting a full investigation by daylight. McNamara had that information. He did not pass it to the president. The Johnson Library documents establish this. The commander's doubts, the request for a daylight investigation, the walkback of the initial report. McNamara sat on it. Johnson addressed the nation that night without knowing his own field commander had already started questioning the story. McNamara broke the chain where it mattered most. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed Congress on August 7th, 1964. Johnson signed it on August 10th. The resolution gave him authorization to use conventional military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It passed because Congress was told an attack had occurred. NSA documents show intelligence personnel set aside reports that contradicted the attack narrative before Congress voted. Members of Congress also weren't told the real reason the Maddox was operating in those waters. And the Johnson administration's explanation for why the ship was there was, per the declassified record, untrue. By the time Johnson's pen touched the resolution on August 10th, several senior officials, and probably the president himself, per the National Archives materials, had concluded that the August 4th attack had likely not taken place. The resolution passed anyway. The war followed. Here is what that resolution cost. The Defense Casualty Analysis System extract files at the National Archives contain the names. 58,220 U.S. military personnel killed in Vietnam. Historical estimates in the declassified record put Vietnamese civilian and military deaths from both sides at roughly 2 million. The war ran from the resolution's passage in 1964 until the fall of Saigon in April 1975. 11 years. Hundreds of thousands of ground troops deployed. A bombing campaign that by most measures was one of the largest in the history of aerial warfare. All of it authorized by a resolution passed in response to an attack that the men who drafted the resolution had reason to believe never happened. The NSA historian's analysis is careful on one point, and we will be careful too. The declassified documents do not establish that McNamara or Johnson planned from the beginning to fabricate a pretext and then execute it. That is the version that requires seeing inside their heads. We cannot do that. What the documents establish is narrower and, in its own way, worse. McNamara had the commander's doubts. He withheld them from the president on the night Johnson addressed the nation. The NSA had 90% of the signal's intelligence pointing away from an attack. Personnel set it aside. The reports sent forward carried only the supportive fraction. Congress voted without knowing the second attack was contested. Senior officials concluded, before the president signed the resolution, that the attack had likely not occurred. The resolution was signed anyway. Whether any of them believed it in the end, we cannot prove. What is on the record is that the men who had the doubts testified and legislated as if they didn't. The documents have been available since 2005 and 2006, 20 years. The NSA released them. The National Archives holds the Johnson Library recordings. The Defense Casualty Analysis System files are public. The resolution itself is a primary legislative document anyone can read. What we do now is simpler than it sounds. Next time a government presents Congress with an intelligence finding that justifies military force and asks for a vote before the picture is clear, we ask what the dissenting intercepts say. We ask what the field commanders are reporting privately. We ask what the Secretary of Defense is not passing up the chain. The Gulf of Tonkin template has a shape, a reported incident, an urgent resolution, a vote before the contradicting evidence surfaces publicly, a war that outlasts the certainty it was built on. Now we know what the shape looks like. The next one will have the same silhouette. The documents were always there. Quietly, of course. The pattern across the record tonight. The signal intercept was filed. The historian's finding was published. The cable marked classified was eventually released. All of it documented. None of it consulted before the vote that sent a generation to war. The cost was paid in full. The resolution passed. The deployments followed. The document admitting the doubt arrived decades later, after the math was already done. So we read the classified annex before we trust the press conference. We find the internal record before we credit the testimony. The gap between what was known and what was said is always on file somewhere. Next time a resolution moves fast and the dissenting intercepts are slow to surface, we know what that gap means. All on the record, all admitted, all after the fact.
This has been the Digital Madman. If you enjoyed this, please share it, subscribe, and smash the like button so we can get the algorithm to pick it up. Thank you, and I will speak with you next time.